this was a demonstration of what Max is capable of. Lewis out-qualifies George. Yes.
Now you have to, Max is taking things to another level to where he's literally carrying Red Bull on his shoulders, right? Like, and now the only question that you could have moving forward is, can he keep doing this for the next, what is it, 14, 13 odd races that are left? That's the only question left, because it doesn't look like Checo is going to be in the mix. This is a visual manifestation of the frustration that's going on with the car not being quick, because this would be a different conversation had Ferrari genuinely been in the mix for fighting for a podium and or a race win. And fix it, Fred.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Tired F1 Pod. We're coming to you straight after, well, not straight after, the Spanish Grand Prix 2024.
Yeah.
Ammar, how are you doing?
Oh man, I am slightly devastated, but we'll get into that.
I'm guessing this is a Ferrari devastation as always. Well, we're going to get to that for sure, but there was a bunch of stuff to get into for this race. First of all, how did you digest it? What did you think? Did you enjoy the race, or?
I mean, I think the problem with this race was that it came after Canada, and I'm not quite sure you're going to top that. Maybe there'll be a few races down the road that kind of present some of the same elements. This felt like a pretty pedestrian race, and compared to that, although it was intriguing. I mean, I think you kind of have to look at the battle at the front, with George getting that excellent start, and you kind of had to wonder for a while. It seemed like there were, between Max, Lando, and the two Mercedes, I think anything was possible. But in the end, it ended up being more or less what we've experienced most of the season, that Max being Max. And I think, again, outside of the Ferrari drama, there's probably not a whole lot that surprises us.
There was I mean, there was a lot of promise that there was going to be loads of overtaking. There was going to be shuffling for position and things like that. But ultimately, I agree with you. I think the cars kind of dictated the car characteristics of each team dictated how that race played out. But that's not to say there wasn't some intrigue, and especially between Max and Lando. This race for me definitely underlined something about Max Verstappen, because we had talked a lot about where Max pans out in the pantheon of all-time greats, and I had said that one of the things that I need to see from Max before I can absolutely put him in that top echelon is what he's going to be like when the car's not competitive and there's a bit of a battle for the championship. And this race was a proper demonstration, and it's not the first one this season, but it's one that really underlined where the driver made the difference, and where Max had to be good wheel to wheel, had to be decisive, had to be able to manage his tires and make sure that he was on top of things more than his rival, and he did that. That was a proper champion's drive. Not that I need to see him have a champion's drive lights to flag, but this was a demonstration of what Max is capable of.
I think that we've said this before, right? You could make a good argument that if he does win this season, which by the looks of it, it doesn't seem like anyone can stop him, that this is arguably just as good, if not better, than the 2021 season because of all these drives he's already had in the season. And barring that DNF in Melbourne, I mean, this would not be as close as it is even right now. And it's not that it's very close at the moment either, although there's a long way to go. I will say, though, we should also take a moment to give Red Bull a lot of props too, right? For how all the acrimony that's been surrounding them, all the issues that have been there, even with re-signing Checo as recently as a few weeks ago, and all the buzz that came around there. All of that drama, they seem to also do a very good job in terms of getting the car where they could possibly get it. And then also on Sunday, be sharp with their strategy. I mean, they didn't make a mistake. I mean, you could argue that, McLaren probably lost a step there in the way they tried to attack the strategy. I have no issues with it because they were trying something different. But you could again see when it came to dictating how the race should go, that Red Bull were kind of, at their peak. And even that by itself helped him as well. And by no means am I taking anything away from him, because this was yet another stellar drive. But this is now what we've come to expect from him, right?
Yeah, I think we should probably have a little look at how the race played out, because I think that will pinpoint exactly the areas where Max really made all of the difference on this one. So can we talk about the start?
Let's go.
Because there's a little bit to talk about there. So I think there's three drivers in the start conversation here. First one is Max, second one is Lando, and the third is your favorite, George freaking Russell.
All right.
What a start. What
Yeah.
a start. So let's just quickly talk about George, because George started fourth on the grid, started 200ths behind, qualified 200ths behind. No, it wasn't 200s, it was 2000s, wasn't it?
2000s, yeah.
2000s behind Lewis, who, as predicted, managed to get something out of the car this time and out qualifies his teammate. But use that the double slipstream that he got behind his teammate Max and Lando to slingshot his way around the outside of turn one, in a way reminiscent of how Max Verstappen did the same thing in Mexico 2021. I thought that was an incredible move. Absolutely used the opportunity. He was talking about this on the grid beforehand, wasn't he? He talked about this even on Saturday, that the best position on the grid is the clean side in fourth, because he's going to get the slipstream, and he absolutely used it. And then became a little bit of a roadblock, but the move around the outside was aggressive. It was clean, and it got him into a position where he could dictate things a little bit. He was leading for 2 laps in the end. What did you make of that?
Yeah, I don't that was spot on, right? I mean, he made the most of what he got, and that was the right spot to be in. I keep thinking back to that would have been, that could have been a Ferrari in there, right? Because if they had done just slightly better, they could have been in there, and that could have been a different race of Ferrari. So I think what George did was absolutely maximize his chances there. In the end, Mercedes are while they're in the mix, they're still a step behind Red Bull, and they're still probably half a step behind McLaren. So I didn't actually expect him to kind of hang on to first place. And it did seem like Max was just kind of waiting his time and being sensible with his tires and everything that, again, we've come to expect Max to do in race. I mean,
I don't agree with that.
I mean,
actually
he
don't
was going to
agree
go
with
after,
that.
but I mean, this is how they were just so fast that it was unavoidable, right? I mean, I don't think it took like a brash, or, I mean, his move was fantastic, by the way, but when he overtook George, but I mean, I don't think it was like he had to like kind of run his tires out or something.
So this is where we're going to disagree a little bit, because I think that showed the difference between Max and Lando. But I'm going to get to that in a second, because the first thing I want to talk about is how Lando managed to lose this race, because it happened for me at the start. That first of all, he got a bad start. He got a bit too much wheel spin. Actually, the first part of his start was okay, but then he got bogged down a little bit. And instead of aiming for the apex of turn one, he started to try and squeeze
Max.
Max.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and that's what allowed George to come past both of them. It gave George the space to come around the outside, but Lando was sitting there too busy squeezing Max. And I think, look, if one of two things had happened, if either Lando had been successful in that squeeze and Max had ended up behind him into turn one, or George hadn't got ahead of either of them, and either Max comes out first or Lando comes out first out turn one, then I think Lando had more of a chance. But that squeeze meant that if Max gets through, then Lando's lost out. It has lost out to Max. That's fine. I think you could get that back. But the fact that it allowed George through as well scuppered his race. Absolutely scuppered his race.
Yeah.
So I think Lando, in hindsight, it's difficult to do this in real time. It's much easier to do this when you're looking back at it, right? But But Lando, I think, will probably look at that and think, okay, I got a bad start. I mean, he said this himself, that I lost this in the start. But I think once he realized he had a bad start, with George charging at him from behind, I think the squeeze on Max was probably not the right thing to do. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I agree with you. I think he could have probably been, again, this happens so fast, right? Like this is when it's even faster than the blink of an eye. So I think it's easy, as you said, in hindsight, we can do everything perfectly, right? But I think if he were given that chance again, I'm guessing he would probably not try to squeeze Max as much, and then just kind of see how it plays out at the first couple corners. And if Max gets away, he gets away, and so be it. And then I think McLaren's shown to be much quicker a little bit later in the race, and they've kind of shown that form that they can actually catch up in the end. So they could have played that long game, but I think you're right. I mean, look, a bad start and then kind of letting George by, and that was his race done there effectively. Although I do think McLaren could have probably run a slightly different strategy than they did, as instead of waiting out that far out and that far long in those first set of pit stops. So, but it is what it is. It is what it is. I mean, I can't,
Well,
like I said,
I
I
don't know
can't
about
really
that
argue
either.
that, right? I mean, I think in hindsight, you could, again, like I said, you could do things a little bit different and maybe the outcome's different. But as to quote Max and not fully quote him, right? If ifs and buts can lead to different outcomes all the time, right? But I think this was a good race, right? In that regard, I think you can see where everyone stacks up to, and we should talk about that in a second here. But I agree with you. He lost that race at the start.
So the third driver here was Max. So Max was the only one out of these. Well, Max was the one out of Lando and George that was laser focused on what he needed to do, which was to do everything he could to be first into the first corner. He got probably the same initial start that Lando did, but a much better secondary phase. And he survived being squeezed onto the grass. I mean, I've seen drivers do that before and absolutely mess it up. Just look at Daniel Ricciardo in Australia 2019. You know, he just first race for Renault, squeezed onto the grass, lost his front wing. But Max didn't do that. Max kept his foot in, was aggressive, came out ahead of Lando into turn one, and then did the thing that he needed to do. Now, I think the initial phase of this race played out to how these cars, how Red Bull and McLaren differentiate, like what their strengths are. And he said it in the little driver's call room as well, didn't he? That actually it was always the first shot that you got, you had to take it to be able to get the best out of your tires, because the Red Bull seems to be really good on his tires at the beginning of a stint, no matter what Max can do in terms of tire preservation and things. By the end of the stint, he's losing out a little bit. So he needs to make the tires count at the beginning. So he understood the brief and he absolutely did that. And that, for me, is why I think it's not just a matter of Max just doing a routine move onto George. That was the key. Because if he'd been stuck behind George for longer than those two laps, you heard Gianpiero Lambiase over the radio
Be
telling
sensible.
him that this is the moment, right?
Yeah.
If you're going to make this work, it has to be now.
Yeah, but
And Max absolutely nailed it. Absolutely nailed it.
yeah,
The
but do
first
you think he
opportunity
would
he
ever
gets,
be stuck behind George? And I mean, the Red Bull
mate, whether
is
whether
just
that's whether that's a whether that's a an inherent part of Max or an inherent part of that Red Bull car, he still needed to get past George. And it's not
sure.
like George was going to make it easy. In fact, he didn't make it easy. He
Yeah.
absolutely he tried to hang it around the outside, the inside of turn one, the outside of turn two. He made that a challenge. So Max had to get that move done through turn three and round the outside. That's not where you pass other people. But he nailed him, absolutely nailed him in a way that Lando just didn't. And Lando was just then stuck behind George. And like I said, if either Lando had been just behind Max, or he'd come out ahead of Max with George in front into turn one, I think this would have been a different race. But because he was behind George, and one, because he just couldn't find a way past George. Maybe that's a little bit to do with how the McLaren treats its tires and is just much better towards the end of a stint. And we saw that towards the end of the race as well.
Yeah.
Or because Lando just
Yeah.
isn't as decisive in battle as
Yeah.
Max is, and maybe nobody is quite as
Well, I mean,
good as Max is.
I would.
That scuppered his race.
I would say in fairness to these guys, right? I don't think anyone has been able to race Max quite that way up until this season, right? So there is an element of getting used to this, right? Because I think really after 2021,
Yeah,
there were
I
maybe
agree with
only a
that.
handful of instances where maybe it was Leclerc and Max, at least for those first few races in 22, where they were really going at it in a way that were more or less equals, right? So I suspect Lando will get better with these starts as more time passes. I know the pressure is unique, and the idea of going to battle with Max, I think that's kind of where George capitalized, right? And whoever is going to start in that fourth place was going to have a really nice sort of double toe to work with, right? So that's great. I mean, this is what we want ultimately, right? From our races, right? That this is the start was cracking really in that regard, and no one took each other out too, amazingly enough. So there's that.
Yeah, which is why I find I found the race a fun one to watch, and yeah, I do take your point that Lando's not been in the thick of a championship battle before, so he's he's green in this regard, and I think yeah maybe he's in that sort of 2018 2019 Max Verstappen era at the moment where
Yeah, everyone.
he's in a car that could potentially do something, but isn't quite ring ready, as it were, to be able to make the most of it. But I don't think that should take away anything from what Max is showing us he can do
Absolutely.
right now,
Yeah.
which is I would compare those moves to what Lewis was doing sort of 2018,
Yeah.
2019. That
Yeah.
you think back to Sochi in 2018, where he had to make a move coming out of the pits on Sebastian Vettel, and first opportunity he gets, nails him. Does the same thing in Italy. He has an opportunity, he nails it. That's what Max is doing right now. Yeah, he might have the car that allows him to do it in those situations, but in this race, I do not think he had the fastest car. Yes, he put himself in a position to do that, but he did that. He made himself. Um,
But yeah.
he got himself into a position with his moves and his tire management to be able to put himself in a position where no matter what McLaren did, where no matter what Lando did with his late stint pace, they weren't getting past him.
Yeah, I think this was a very unique race in that regard, right? I mean, the McLarens had the pace to stay up with him and beat him, but Oscar was nowhere in the mix. Had he been in the mix, that could have been a slightly different race. I also think again now you have to Max is taking things to another level to where he's literally carrying Red Bull on his shoulders, right? Like and now the only question that you could have moving forward is can he keep doing this for the next, what is it, 14, 13 odd races that are left? That's the only question left because it doesn't look like Checo is going to be in the mix. I mean, I know he had a three-race grid penalty, but his qualifying was still pretty pedestrian, right? It's not like he put his car in the top five where it really deserves to be. And so I think that this is going to be the question moving forward is what can Red Bull get out of Checo, if anything, to support Max? Because this ended up again. If the Ferraris were in the mix, which they have been in the past, that this could have again been a different result. But there's nothing. We unconditionally Max has got to get his flowers, and it's a brilliant race by him. Like if I'm a Max fan, like this is more satisfying a win than many others he's had
Yeah,
this
yeah.
season,
I mean,
definitely. So
yeah, and I think we do need to emphasize that a lot of the arguments about Max and where he stacks up um, are based on, oh, well, he's in a dominant car and he doesn't have any competition. Well, that's not what's happening right now. He's got
absolutely,
competition and
yeah.
he's still winning.
He's-
Um,
yeah.
it's he races badly wheel to wheel and he's just aggressive. Well, actually, I think he has actually taken a step, right? Like his moves weren't aggressive dive bombs. They were well thought out. How am I going to work this through a corner? Maybe he drives different drivers differently. He races against them slightly differently, but certainly against Lando and George on the weekend, it was there was nothing really
Yeah.
to fault.
And I mean, I think we'll probably debate this more as time passes, but I still think that in the race, Red Bull has the best overall car. Even though the margins are much lesser, and I think McLaren, as you said, towards the end of stints are far more competitive. I think you can see. I mean, I talked about this a couple of weeks ago. Certainly, everyone's been talking about, Barcelona sort of being this sort of real measuring stick of where everyone's at. And if you just look at qualifying, right, you can kind of see what the pecking order is really. And although Red Bull don't have the quickest car on Saturdays, they didn't quite have that in 22 either, by the way. They didn't quite have that even last year, right? Ferrari had how many poles? Like 14 poles or something like that. So I think again for Sunday they're set up well, and I think again what Max is doing now is he's showing that he can win from different places on the grid. Now I just keep thinking, good God, thank God he didn't qualify fourth, right? Because because he'd be gone. He'd be gone in like in 200
Yeah,
meters. Like go see you later. So
yeah,
I think
yeah,
that's it.
yeah.
For me, the only questions are, will he get any kind of support from Checo? And maybe it does improve
So,
as the year passes, but good God, I mean, at
yeah.
this point, it's like really hard.
I mean, sometimes I feel like he just doesn't need it. His team were just incredible behind him. You
Yeah,
talked about this a minute ago, but actually, first of all, knowing that the setup that they needed was to crank on a bit more rear wing. He was the only driver, and we looked at this in our qualifying video as well. He's the only driver in qualifying that wasn't lifting through turn 14, right?
it's amazing.
Which you might think, well, okay, that's a meh. But actually, that gave Red Bull the opportunity to have a little bit more pace coming onto the back straight, which means that his overtakes were facilitated a little bit. And like you said, in terms of pit stops and strategy, they were second to none. That everyone was questioning why he was on used tires when he had a brand new set um,
Yeah,
available. Played out perfectly.
yeah.
The race played out exactly to that. So they had a brand new set for that all important final stint when Lando was coming at him, and the pit stops,
1.9, right?
where
Yeah, yeah.
1.9, where Lando had a sticky rear
With
tire,
yeah,
so all of those things add up, right? And when you've got that combination of a absolutely pin sharp race team, and they have been right throughout this era of Red Bull dominance, this new era of Red Bull dominance. They've been absolutely on it with all of their strategy, all of their operations. When you've got that, and you've got that driver, you can afford a little bit of performance to bleed away from your car, and you're still going to win. It's absolutely incredible what's happening there at the moment. Really, really good.
yeah.
Can we talk about Mercedes for a
Sure,
second?
sure. I want enough Ferrari time though, but yeah, let's go.
Okay, we'll do a quick one on Mercedes. First of all, Lewis out qualifies. I knew it's going to happen.
Great.
The car starts to happen. The car starts to come.
Has the cult
Uh,
quieted down a little bit, or no? Is it still running full
no,
force?
no. Now the argument is Mercedes have been caught out with their tire blankets, so
Oh,
therefore they're having to fix that issue. So therefore that's why Lewis had
yeah,
a
they
better
have.
qualifying. Um, but apparently that's all you need to do. If you're not happy with the way your driver is being treated, just send in an anonymous email
Okay.
to as many people as you possibly
I'm
can.
looking up Ferrari's email right now.
Yeah.
So
And you'll get what you want. Um, yeah, I mean, I think that their car sort of reverted to mean a little bit. George did brilliantly to get off the line the way he did, like we said, but he was always going to get overtaken. Um, and I think he probably would have finished ahead of Lewis as well, but for that hard stint at the end. I guess it was a gamble that wasn't out of the
yeah,
question.
yeah,
Carlos Sainz tried the same thing, didn't he? But the hards just weren't really a tire that was going to do anything. And that was essentially good information for Mercedes and Lewis, who was then put onto a used set of softs in the final stint with a slightly better tire differential, and was able to come past him. I have to say though, Lewis was also back to his brilliant best, because if I'm going to talk about Max pulling off decisive moves, Lewis pulling off that move on George for the first time in a while. Taking the inside line, which he often hasn't done recently. He's often been forced to go around the outside in these give and take moments. Got his move done, was decisive, made it when he needed to make it, and it's not like he got an easy pass like Carlos gave Charles later in the race. That for me again, Lewis qualifying well, managing his tires, making the moves when he needed to make the moves. Again, that's Lewis back to his
Yes.
superlative best,
No,
I think, and hopefully we'll see a bit more of that, and shut um, the
rubbish.
detractors
Yeah.
down. Well,
Yeah.
especially the ones that are like, oh, he's lost it. Oh, he's too old. I mean, that qualifying wasn't the qualifying session of a driver that has lost it, and that race performance certainly wasn't either. There were more than enough moments where he could have
So
finished fourth and didn't.
and to his credit, he came out after Canada and said, "Look, I probably ran the worst weekend that I have, right? Was it a race or qualifying, whatever it was." He went back, addressed it, and it's done, and we can move on. Like hopefully that lays to rest all kinds of stupidity that's been
It
out
won't.
there, whether it's Mercedes or not.
It won't.
But
You
it's
know it
okay.
absolutely
Look, if
won't.
you're gonna complain about something, you're gonna complain no matter what, then go ahead and complain. That's all you can
Yeah.
do. That's
Yeah,
all it is.
I
Only I am
I
the one
agree.
coming off this race that has a legitimate complaint. No one else. I will accept nobody complaining about anything else unless it has to do with Ferrari.
Okay, let's complain about Ferrari. Go.
Oh man, I don't know where to start. Well, let me say this before I start talking because I'm gonna ramble a while. What did you make?
Uh, I think I think Ferrari, they brought a big fat upgrade to this race. They did the same thing last year, and I don't think they've properly understood it, which is why last year you had that massive disparity between Sainz being on the podium and Charles, out in quali one. Um, this year, it wasn't quite as extreme a result, but I think they'll be a bit disappointed with the way that their upgrade worked. They are clearly a step behind where McLaren are at the moment. And Mercedes seemed at this race at least to have overtaken them as well. How that's going to pan out over the course of the next couple of races, I don't know. Hopefully, they'll understand the car a bit better, and they'll be back on it again in Austria. I really want to see it because, um, one, for purely selfish reasons,
Or next
my,
year? It's in
my boy's
planning for
going here next year, and like
2025.
this is the wrong time for Mercedes to peak, really. But anyway, there we are.
So you couldn't have had
Um,
a worse weekend either.
um,
Good and bad, but yeah.
uh,
Um,
but 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 but
yeah.
also this was again, the car kind of panned out to where it was going to pan out, and the drivers kind of did what they were going to do. But I guess we're going to have a little chat about how there's no longer any love in paradise.
Oh, come on. I reject that completely. Before I get into that, I think Ferrari are in trouble. I think they're squarely in trouble now because, as you said, they are clearly that. I mean that gap is pretty evident, right? And we have to use this race now as a benchmark, right? Because this is the data we have. We're up until a certain point in the season. McLaren brought a lot of upgrades earlier, and they seem to be working well. Ferrari brought a lot of upgrades here that don't seem to be working. I mean, you could argue that maybe minus the upgrades, they could have been a little bit higher up the field, really. And they don't seem to. This is the part that bothers me about them, right? We came off the high of Monaco, and then we've had two race weekends that, I mean, one of them in Canada was an absolute disaster, which shouldn't have happened. Even on your worst days, you should be able to at least score some points. I mean, good God, they could have been a sixth and a seventh in there, but not having done that and then now coming to this race with all the promise that's out there, it just shows to me that they're not quite there yet. And that of course they've had stellar moments, but they haven't pieced it together. And maybe this is why they're going hard after Adrian Newey because they feel like they're missing that element. And we've talked about this, right, with Ferrari earlier this week, in fact, like in thinking about where they're at, it seems like there's still the organizational area that is not quite up to speed. In terms of their strategy, I mean, again, it was a bit nervous for me because I mean, Charles called it, right? He didn't want to go on the hards and he had the right idea. Again, doing it from the cockpit, not something I want to see. And of course, they took a gamble with Carlos, which I'm less concerned about because I think they were just trying to do something at that point. I mean,
Because Carlos is your second driver, so I mean, it
well, I
doesn't really
mean,
matter,
it's
does
not
it?
even that. I mean, clearly they were behind. They were clearly behind the two Mercedes and
So
and
would you have been
Lando
more
and
upset if Leclerc had gone on the hard tires then?
I wouldn't have because in the end it would have been the same result, right? And I think what's happening now, and I'll get into the driver stuff too, right? Because I know you're going to ask me that, but I think what you're seeing is they're having a moment here. And I think this is a very pivotal these next couple of races to see if they can rescue anything out of it. I mean, they should be competitive in Austria, right? They should be. They've won there in the past. But now it's a little bit hard to say because, of course, McLaren are doing well and Mercedes are doing well. And of course, Red Bull is Max is Max, right? But it's a little bit of a question mark as to where they find themselves. And I think the fact that Mercedes are on the scene this quickly, right? Because had Mercedes been a little bit off, they would have been up there a couple more spots. But that would have only been because Mercedes then didn't improve as much as they did. And you're now starting to see those gains. So I think they're in a bit of a spot of bother right now.
Yeah. So yeah, I think there's a little bit of technical stuff going on here. I did hear on the grapevine that perhaps Enrico Cardile, the chief technical officer at
Ferrari
Ferrari, is
set to leave.
about to walk out and head off to Aston Martin. And from what I understand, like part of the reason for that is because Ferrari are so focused on bringing in Adrian Newey that Enrico's like, well, you've got me. What the heck is wrong?
Yes.
And he's walking out. What I don't want to see is that kind of politics going on at Ferrari, right? Because that's what trips them up all the time is internal stuff causing problems on track. Like Red Bull have had all of the issues that they've had over the course of the beginning of the season, and yet when it comes to race day, they're absolutely on top of it, even if their car has gone backwards a little bit. Ferrari don't really. I'm nervous that anything that happens internally causes big problems on track. Now, I don't think. Look, don't get me wrong. Like, I don't think they're about to fall off a cliff or anything. I think they just need to understand their upgrade a little bit better. I think that's what they need to do.
Yeah, but saying that is not good enough, right? Because time is passing away too. Like understanding it is correct. I hear you, but at this stage in the season, it's okay for you to be behind Red Bull, right? But you should be right there with McLaren, and you were
You
ahead
can't
of them.
dictate how, but you can't dictate how other
But you
teams
can't.
are.
But the thing of this cannot be like, okay, we got to go understand. I mean, that was what we said after Canada. We did everything wrong. Okay, well now what? Imola was kind of like Spain, right? Where they were a step behind too. Like, but how many races is it going to take to kind of get there?
Physics,
So
man.
yeah, I know.
What can you do?
I know, but this goes to show where you're at. I mean, look at Mercedes. I mean, look at the turnaround they've had from Australia. Like, I mean, that's crazy. Now, of course, they probably
Ammar,
had.
how long has that
I
taken?
know it has, but
That's an improvement, and they're not there yet. But that's an improvement that's been 2 years in the making. Yeah, this has started with the silly Monaco upgrade that they had last year. It's taken that long for them to get to where they are now, and they're still not at the front.
yeah,
Like
but
to expect Ferrari with one upgrade to suddenly be there, like McLaren managed this last year, and yes, I agree that in terms of how they've come along, their correlation must be off the charts because they're able to bring performance with absolutely every little upgrade they bring. But this isn't how that's not how every team works, and it's just not. I just don't think it's. I just don't think it's reasonable to expect that that's how it's going to work for everyone.
well,
Um, Go on.
well, I'm gonna say it is because that's why you're seeing what you're seeing between the two drivers.
Okay, hit me because I do want to I do want to talk about this, right?
That's
Because
come
you
on, go
have
for it.
you've played this narrative a lot that like, oh, I'm really worried about Lewis coming
Yeah,
next season because
yeah,
they're gonna
yeah,
have a fight
yeah,
with each other. Well,
yeah.
with Carlos is a competitive driver, right? And
Mm.
he did make a point of that after the race, yes, on Sunday. And I will argue that it's not about having a number one and a number two driver, right? It is about having the best driver pairing you can possibly have. Because if you have a driver that is happy to come in number two, and this is what you quoted that Carlos was so happy to play second fiddle to Charles
Nope,
Leclerc
did
in
not.
Monaco. He said, yes, you did. That's exactly
I
what he
did
said.
not in Monaco, yes, but not
In Monaco,
overall.
exactly.
Yeah, yeah.
Why that if you say it in Monaco, mate, it's relevant
But
for the entire season.
okay,
If you show me a
I know it's
driver
not
that
real.
is happy to come in number two to
No one
his
is.
teammate,
No one is.
you'll show me a loser. And that
Okay.
is not what
All right.
Carlos Sainz is.
Okay.
Carlos Sainz
Okay.
is not a loser,
Okay.
right?
Here's why you're wrong. Okay, here's the thing.
Hit
If
me.
this was Lewis Hamilton instead of Carlos Sainz, this would be even worse. And oh, by the way, the cult that's gone after Mercedes would be all over Charles and
I
Ferrari.
don't, mate, we're
All
not
the
talking
same
about the
thing. So,
cult. We are
but
not talking
that's
about the
but okay,
cult.
but okay,
This is
but
not about this is not
telling
about
me
the
that Lewis
fans.
would
This is
have
about the
reacted.
driver.
You're telling me that Lewis and Charles wouldn't have had that. If this is how what's happening
Yeah,
next
but
year,
I
and
don't
Lewis
mind
has
that. I think that's great. You
okay,
should have that.
but hear me out. Hear me out. I agree with you. Look, this was embarrassing in
Oh,
many
okay, you
ways.
agree with me.
I
Great.
agree with you, but with a big caveat. And the big caveat is what you're seeing is the symptom of an underlying disease, which I just talked about, which is the frustration from the last 3 weeks, 2 race weekends, but last 3 weeks, boiling over on the racetrack. Because what you can see
What
is
frustration?
hang on, frustration at the fact that Ferrari are not there. This is exactly how it plays out, and both drivers want to take things in their own hands. Now they both taken different directions. What the hell were you talking about in the driver's briefing? Because both of them walked away with something different. Is there a lost in translation issue? What's going on? Because one of them says, well, we had new tires. We had to go attack Mercedes right away. The other one says, no, we could have waited later in the stint. What is going on? That to me is an organizational issue. Yes, we can blame the drivers for being that way, and maybe they shouldn't have been doing that. We can go about it all and all, but it's not like what you're seeing now is them being frustrated from last week. Because let me tell you this, everything that you just said about Carlos, he was so complimentary of Charles after Monaco. He talked about how emotional he felt seeing Charles win in front of his home crowd and everything that went on. So it's not a question of all of a sudden now they're at it with each other. The frustration is now with the team. We've seen this with Charles in the past, where he starts to take matters in his own hands when Ferrari go, when he feels like they're not in the mix, and that's shown up in the way of him crashing and all of those things, right? This is just yet a manifestation of that. And that's why I say that Ferrari are in trouble. It's not like all of a sudden they want to go at it with each other, but Charles can feel his chance of winning a championship or competing with Max to win one slipping out of his own hands. He's now behind Lando, and it's probably not looking good, as at least as of today, to him getting back in second place, let alone trying to fight with Max. And I think that's what you're seeing play out on track. That's what I say.
Yeah, I think both those drivers want to win something.
Sure.
Carlos isn't gonna back down. Like that's what you want him to do. You want Carlos to not attack Charles into turn one, not try and make that move. Where Carlos is saying, well, actually, no, I don't want to mess up.
Yeah.
I don't want to lose the opportunity to have the best strategy, because if Charles is going to slow down, then I'm going to go past him.
But can I tell you this? Can I tell you
Yeah.
this? In the end, even if they don't fight, do you think they make it on the podium? Do you think either
No.
of them make no?
No, but
That's
not
my
the
point. But that's my point. That's I
right.
mean, Carlos
So
was
how does
trying to
this
do.
translate to next year
But
then?
Carlos is
So
hang on.
if Ferrari
We'll come
have
back to next. We'll come back to next year. But the reason
that's what we're
Carlos was
talking about,
trying
isn't it?
hard. No, hang on. I'm getting there. The reason Carlos was trying hard was because he wanted to do everything he thought he could do to get on the podium. He knew that first and second wasn't on there. The real question was they maybe thought
Yes.
they had a chance to beat Mercedes, but evidently not. Like they could have ran the perfect race, and the reality is that their car is slower for whatever reason. Not only slower than Red Bull, not only slower than McLaren, but slow. It's a miracle Oscar wasn't in there. Otherwise, even that wasn't in there, right? Like you wouldn't have been able. So the reality for me is, yes, we can talk about the squibbing and all that because it is the more sensationalized thing to talk about. But the reality is they just weren't quick enough. And also hanging on to those extra, the new softs, that made no sense. They had a better chance of getting third and fourth had they run those new softs. So I think, again, this is my issue with all of that. So this pans out for next year. I mean, to me, it's like, so you're saying that Lewis wouldn't have reacted that way? The two
No,
of
no,
them,
no.
I mean,
I'm not. No,
maybe
I'm
not in
not
Spain,
saying
but
that.
if it's Silverstone, you
No,
don't
I'm
think
not.
it's going to.
I'm not saying. I'm not
That's
saying
fine.
that. I'm saying that he would fight for that position, because that's what a teammate. That's what a driver should do. This whole lovey-dovey nonsense is
I
nonsense.
never said lovey-dovey. I talked about harmony.
Ammar,
And look,
Ammar, you
throughout the season,
verbatim, you basically you quoted a video of Carlos Sainz saying that he will do what he can to help Charles Leclerc win in Monaco,
yeah,
right?
yes,
And you
because
said,
he was
"Oh,
slower then. He was slower. He already knew it.
mate,
But they were very well matched here.
the driver that accepts he's slower and then goes, I'm just going to help
No,
my
no, no.
teammate."
But
Is
when
that's
he says that matters, right? Because it was post qualifying, he said that, so that makes sense. I mean, look, he is not. I mean, but we
no,
already we don't even need to go by words because we
Lewis
have
wasn't saying
actions
that.
there. we have actions there. And look, well, let's see. We're to be determined. Let's see how this works out next year. Because good God, you're gonna have the Tifosi on one end, and you're gonna have the Lewis
Who
Hamilton,
cares about
and
them?
then let's see how that
Mate,
works out.
it doesn't matter about the fan bases. Look, this is about the drivers,
But
right?
it's
The
not
fan
about
bases can
you're
can
saying
chat
that
all they want to.
it doesn't matter about fan bases on a weekend where Toto Wolff had to make a point about the fan base. That's not the point. I agree
Did
with
that
you.
affect on track performance?
I don't
No, I
know.
don't
Maybe
think it
who
did.
knows? We
So that's what I'm talking about here, right? Is
but
this is
but
about the drivers driving and like blocking out all the
But
noise from their
if you
fan
think that
bases.
Charles and Carlos are going at it, they're going to have the same issue next year. And for me, the issue,
Correct. That's how
but
it
that's
should
what I'm saying.
be.
But that's what I'm saying. The issue isn't you put any two drivers in there. That's not my problem. What have I said right now the whole time? This is an organizational issue. Look, we've given Fred a lot of flowers, but we got to call him out on this. Like, if he, what happened in that briefing? What happened there that you had two drivers going two different directions? And oh, by the way, it's not like they were fourth
Bruv,
like George, where
that
one of them
was
had a chance to get into a double slipstream and kind of the double toe and kind of go there. It wasn't there. So I don't even understand
But
why they're
they
fighting.
could have okay, but what happened is they had a briefing and one of their drivers decided to go against that briefing. So that is a driver issue. That's not an organizational issue. They
It
had a
is also
meeting
an
and they said
organizational issue because you're not holding, and we
Carlos
don't know why. It depends on
Carlos did what he wanted to do
who
because
went on that.
he wanted to get the better position.
It also depends on who went against the word, right? Because here's the thing: I didn't like what Charles said, by the way, and I'm not opposed to them. Look, in the heat of the moment after the race, yeah, I'm not sure that was warranted. Like him saying, "Oh, Carlos was trying to show off too much" or whatever. I'm paraphrasing there. I don't think that was necessary. But again, to me, this is a visual manifestation of the frustration that's going on with the car not being quick. Because this would be a different conversation had Ferrari genuinely been in the mix for fighting for a podium and or a race win. And they knew going into that their best chance was hoping that Mercedes magically lost some of their pace, or they maybe had set up their car best for qualifying, but not
And
really in the race, and it never panned out.
I guarantee that in a carbon copy of this situation next season, the only thing that I'm going to hear from you, right, bookmark this, is, oh, they shouldn't have signed Lewis Hamilton. Why does he have to go
No,
against
no, no,
team
no, no, no,
orders?
no, 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 no.
Trust me, that's what you're going to
Let me
say.
pull you back on this a little bit. I do not have a problem with the Lewis Hamilton signing because that is what you do. My problem with this is how are you going to manage next year? And oh, by the way, I will be telling you this: if they squander away a race win on something like this, I don't have a problem with this. Just like, by the way, I have maintained this in the same issue when we were talking about Mercedes a couple of weeks ago. When you're fighting for anything less than a podium, whatever. Go have at it. They were not looking quick enough to win today, or forget win. They didn't even look good enough to be on the podium. And that is the central issue. The driver stuff, look, throughout the season, there's going to be tension. There's going to be some love. There's going to be tension. As the year wanes, there's probably going to be more separation. This is how kind of this works. Look, you're coming off a high of what Lewis did this weekend, but next weekend could look completely different. And oh, by the way, we had that moment in qualifying too, where George said something on the radio there. My point is that
Yeah,
is all
I don't have a
noise.
problem with that
But
though.
that's
You're
that is
allowed
all.
to have
I'm also
animosity
saying the same
between
thing.
drivers.
I'm saying the same thing.
Not
Fix
in
the
Monaco, you won't.
freaking car is my point. Like, why are we so behind? It doesn't make sense. It's okay for us to be behind Red Bull. Why are we behind Mercedes all of a sudden? Like, that's supposed to be. And I think that is the frustrating thing that's being lost in all of this. Like, sure, you shouldn't fight, and they'll correct it and whatever. And now
Of course, they
Italy's going
should
to come.
fight.
Fight, no problem. But I mean, to hear that, oh, they lost a chance at a podium because of that, like that's ridiculous to me. Like that's again, and I don't blame the drivers for it. Look, rarely will I ever blame the drivers because they're the ones that are out there. They have to react in split seconds, and it's easy for us to criticize. But I think what's more fair game in my mind is the overall sort of makeup of what Ferrari is doing on the race weekend. And now we've seen two race weekends where they have looked out of sorts, and you could argue that their car is made only for Monaco and Singapore. Like really, it's starting to look more and more like that. Like they're not going to win unless somebody screws up. And now it's not like they're fighting with Max alone, where they're like, okay, maybe a Red Bull issue with Max can get them a race win. That's how Melbourne was, right? To a certain extent, right? The other teams are right there now. They're not going to have a shot at the podium if they continue like this. And that's my issue. Fix it, Fred.
There you go. Fix it, Fred. So my two takeaways from that are Ferrari are too slow, but you're happy that the drivers are chummy, and that's how you want it. I hear you, man. I hear you.
All right.
Right.
Yes, I'll say that.
On that bombshell, it's time for us to end it. If you like what we're doing here, please like, please subscribe. If you want to hear some more arguments between Ammar and me, please leave us a comment. We read all of them and we respond to as many as we possibly can. We will see you guys in the next one.
Later.